Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I am Shekhar Gupta and my guest this week, well, a great writer, one of the greatest reporters of our times, a friend, an inspiration, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the writer of many books, and the owner of more scoops than any living journalist. Steve Coll, welcome to Walk the Talk.
Shekhar, great to see you.
Nice to see you after so many years.
Yeah, it has been.
Of being fellow travelers.
We managed to find each other on one continent or another every couple or 3 years, I guess.
Absolutely, but Steve, from the times we were in India, 1989 on, there was trouble in Afghanistan, and we traveled for some of those stories together. During the first jihad, the good jihad. But still, those look like such innocent times now.
Yeah, they do. Well, I mean, it was an accident of professional assignment to be traveling in that first jihad and to understand how complicated it was and what the structures were that were feeding this pattern of radicalization during that war, particularly in Pakistan. And because U.S. policy was so heavily involved in the first jihad, in the anti-Soviet jihad, and I was out there for the Washington Post, I just became, I think my colleagues thought I was a little obsessed with subjects like ISI and how the pipeline worked and what the political choices were. And I think a whole generation of journalists that grew up in that time understood after 9/11 what the sort of deep structures were that had created that.
So we all became terror junkies or intrigue junkies or ISI junkies?
ISI junkies, yeah.
Or great game junkies.
Yeah. But also I think, Afghanistan itself, for many journalists who traveled there, it sort of gets under your skin. It's a place apart. It's a place I've traveled just about everywhere, and there's really no place quite like it. Its independence, the way geography has sort of encapsulated the culture, the fact that it's never, that's a fairly young, modern state, but also a very old culture, and there's something about it in wartime also that shaped the experiences, at least of my generation of foreign correspondents. A lot of colleagues lost their lives there. You saw a lot of suffering among Afghan civilians. The sort of sense that this was a country that had been broken by outsiders was also very powerful. Right. So I think the story stayed with us.
Also, it's a strange country where every tribe is like a sovereign republic by itself, and yet for every tribe, there are more tribesmen in a neighboring country than in Afghanistan. Yeah. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than Afghanistan.
And these days in the Gulf as well.
More Tajikistan than in Afghanistan, and Uzbeks and Hazaras and so on. Yeah. It's a peculiar place.
And but the other thing that happened during that time, I think, especially the period in the early 90s after the Soviets left, but before the Mujahideen triumphed in 1992, was that under Najibullah, there was a state, however weak, however limited in Kabul, but there was a state that was shared by Afghans from all sorts of tribes and language groups and ethnic traditions. And so that idea that there really was an Afghanistan worth fighting for did somehow survive at least that phase of the war. And I think after 9/11, it was common in the United States to see Afghanistan as just an ungovernable space dominated by tribes that would submit to no one. But I think a lot of journalists who had been around in that period when we were there recognized that while tribal identity is important in Afghanistan, there's also a state. There's an Afghan state.
And there's an Afghan nationalism.
There's an Afghan nationalism, very powerful, and in the diasporas as well. Right. Those who came from abroad back to try to fix the place.
Even the taxi drivers in Washington where you live.
And it's still going on. Why is Afghanistan resilient under the pressure that it's faced and despite the policy failures? It's because Afghans themselves are still trying to reclaim their own state.
Is that understood in Washington?
I think partially, yeah. The one thing that's happened in the United States since 9/11 is that in the military, but also in the civilian space, but especially in the military, you have a lot of Americans who have now spent a lot of time on the ground in Afghanistan. They've done 2 tours, 3 tours, captains, officers, well-educated, curious, and they've now started to understand the place at a level of depth that wasn't available inside the system before 9/11.
Tuba.com